Realism in foreign policy reflects a messy, dangerous world where too little can be distilled into clear-cut moral absolutes, and thus national interest takes precedence over universal values. Nevertheless, a world ravaged by war, migration, refugee flows, and a demand for dignity across ethnic, religious, and racial lines requires a morally sustainable foreign policy rooted in idealism. Yet realism and idealism can work together. The American diplomatic tradition at its best has employed humanitarianism as a complement to power politics, not as an opponent of it. This all has profound consequences for our great power competition with China and Russia today, and for how the Biden administration will deal with it. Some of the darkest days of the Cold War, governed by realpolitik calculations of power, were also suffused with human rights concerns at the highest official levels. It was what defined the American brand and distinguished it from that of the Soviets. The State Department's Refugee Bureau had its beginnings under President Jimmy Carter, when communist takeovers in Vietnam and Cambodia led to a humanitarian cataclysm as millions streamed out of those countries into Thailand. President Ronald Reagan picked up Carter's torch, with Reagan's Secretary of State, the late George Shultz, who died on February 7th, seamlessly combining hard-headed realism with humanitarianism, especially throughout Africa. I know, I was there as a reporter for The Atlantic. The Shultz State Department exposed the Ugandan regime in 1984 for its mass murder and starvation of over 100,000 civilians in the Luwero Triangle region, which helped lead to a better regime coming to power there and amplifying America's influence in East Africa. Shultz's diplomatic team took the lead in emergency aid to ethnic Eritrean and Tigrayan civilians pouring out of famine-racked Marxist Ethiopia in 1985. In 1988, Shultz denied anti-communist Renamo guerrillas in Mozambique aid under the Reagan Doctrine because of Renamo's gross human rights crimes. It was a key turning point in ending the Mozambican Civil War that would save hundreds of thousands of lives and play a pivotal role in a transition to a post-apartheid Southern Africa. Shultz's actions were part of a larger story. The fact that we were in a worldwide geopolitical competition with the Soviet Union gave us a naked self-interest in engagement with virtually every country in the developing world. The high-water mark of the U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department's humanitarian arm, was during the Cold War, when it had intensive foreign aid programs in many dozens of countries. But it was George Shultz in particular, such an uncharismatic and easily forgotten Secretary of State, yet an extraordinary leader of organizations, who most effortlessly joined idealism together with realism in the last and most pivotal decade of the Cold War. The toppling of communist regimes in 1989 was the culmination of a global strategy, headlined by the Helsinki process in Europe, that was rooted in both hard power and human rights. Shultz, like other successful secretaries of state, understood that the foreign policy of a world power constitutes a hierarchy of needs, and moral action must take its place in that hierarchy to win sustained public support. That is where the link between realism and idealism specifically originates. After all, the fact that the possibility even exists for humanitarian intervention is principally due to the blunt fact of American military power. That power, the hundreds of billions of dollars spent for aircraft carriers, submarines, and fighter jets, has been financed by taxpayers for reasons that go beyond lofty principles, such as protecting sea lines of communication and balancing against adversaries. Such power must first be accumulated for amoral reasons before it can be used for moral reasons. For example, it was U.S. surface warships and submarines in the Mediterranean Sea that launched cruise missiles in the 1999 Kosovo War, even though those platforms were not built and funded with a humanitarian purpose in mind. Indeed, the humanitarian interventions in the 1990s in the Balkans, identified with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and the diplomat Richard Holbrooke, were inextricable from America's great power responsibilities that would soon extend NATO to the Black Sea in the wake of victory in the Cold War. Tension between realism and idealism is natural to a high level of engagement abroad, where crises are nonstop, complex, and contentious. Yet the very fact that such tensions exist is proof of a moral tradition that separates America from authoritarian powers such as China and Russia and their one-dimensional realpolitik. Foreign policy is the foreign extension of a nation's domestic condition, and a demoralized domestic condition wrought us President Donald Trump in November 2016. But Trump's brand of America First neo-isolationism could never delegitimize the other, far more mainstream internationalism of Schultz, Albright, Holbrooke, and others. This is particularly true in an age of high technology, when we can less and less hide from a shrinking, claustrophobic world marked by great power competition and pandemics. It is in that rendezvous with a wider world that realism and idealism are destined to coexist. Great power rivalry is real, but so is a global media environment that is forever judging our actions. Remember that the Cold War ended in triumph because the United States won the battle for hearts and minds in communist Eastern Europe. The declaration of martial law in Poland in 1981 was a defeat for the Soviet Union rather than a victory, because it revealed that after decades of Communist Party rule, the largest of the East Bloc satellites still required the military and security services to keep its population in check. The fall of communism across Central and Eastern Europe followed. Similarly, with Hong Kong, where China's security crackdown has further alienated Taiwan, even as mainland China experienced Orwellian repression, massive human rights violations are now central to Beijing's method of rule, as Chinese geography encompasses subject peoples, such as the Tibetans and Muslim Uyghur Turks. The battle for hearts and minds throughout Greater China has commenced, therefore. Winning that battle requires a foreign policy that blends power politics with a values-driven approach attractive to the Chinese and the rest of the world's peoples. It is that very combination that will provide a decisive edge over America's adversaries in the coming years and decades. To wit, rather than overtly inject ideology into our bipolar struggle with the Chinese, we need to imply it in our daily emphasis on human rights around the world. Realism never dies because it is about limits, constraints, and hard choices. Idealism never dies because ever since the Hebrew prophet Isaiah and the Greek tragedian Euripides, it has appealed to the human spirit. In the creative tension between the two tendencies, America finds its true reputational calling. That was the secret to winning the Cold War. As for our own era of great power struggles, it is partly a matter of recovering the quiet, unassuming example of George Shultz. Cuba is opening up its economy, but don't call it a shift to capitalism just yet. By Ciara Nugent. Under pressure from the economic impact of COVID-19 and U.S. sanctions, Cuba scrapped a ban on most private businesses on Saturday, the latest in a flurry of long-awaited reforms to its communist system triggered by the government in recent weeks, and a sign that the state's grip on the economy is loosening. A series of reforms starting in 2010 have allowed Cubans to work as self-employed people in the private sector, but they can currently only have jobs in 127 narrow categories defined by the government. Most of the 600,000 licenses granted by 2020 cover service industry jobs, like running a restaurant or driving a taxi. On Saturday, the Labor Ministry said the list would be abolished. Instead, there will be a list of 124 jobs prohibited for the private sector, and the rest of the more than 2,000 legal economic activities identified by the government will be fair game. It's the biggest shift in Cuba's system for a decade, according to Oniel Diaz-Castellanos, a Cuban entrepreneur who runs a consultancy helping self-employed people run businesses on the island. This is a fundamental, historic change that we've been asking for a long time, he says. There are a lot of businesses that are illegal and now can be legalized, and there's going to be a lot of innovative ideas that will be unleashed. It's an economic opportunity, not just for entrepreneurs, but for the country. Cuba is badly in need of an economic opportunity. The pandemic has hobbled an economy that was already struggling under the weight of U.S. sanctions introduced by the Trump administration in 2017. Global travel restrictions have shut down the island's tourism sector, the primary market for the businesses run by self-employed Cubans, and a crucial source of foreign exchange for the government. In December, the government said Cuba's GDP had shrunk by 11% since the start of 2020. The crunch has pushed the government to act on a series of long-planned reforms. On January 1st, Cuba launched a program of monetary reordering, rapidly devaluing its currency, the Cuban peso, against the dollar, and scrapping a secondary convertible form of the peso that circulated on the island. At the same time, the government removed universal subsidies on a wide range of goods. As a result, prices in local stores have risen sharply, inflation is rising, and the black market value of the dollar is spiking. Analysts say the labor reform should help to stem social discontent about the economic crisis. It may also distract from rare protests by artists and activists in late 2020 over Cuba's tight limits on freedom of expression, and aid the pursuit of warmer U.S. relations under President Joe Biden. But business leaders hope it's just the start of greater reforms for the private sector. Here's what to know about Cuba's reforms and what they mean for the future of the country's economic system. What does the reform mean for businesses in Cuba? Cubans will now be able to start a private business in most sectors. Ricardo Torres, a pro-reform economist at the University of Havana's Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy, says that it will reduce the power of Cuba's bureaucracy by decreasing the burden on Cubans to prove that their business fits into one of the permitted activities. Now you only have to show that you're not in one of the activities that is explicitly banned. The reform will also change the type of career that Cubans can pursue outside of the public sector. Currently, outside of low state salaries, Cubans can largely only legally make money from low-skilled jobs. Many professional fields like medicine, teaching, and law are likely to appear on the new list of jobs that can be performed only by state employees, which is set to be laid out this week by state television, Torres says. But other fields like technical services, engineering, and economics are likely to open to the private sector for the first time. Economists say the new roles will drive faster growth and new job creation in the private sector. Self-employed people currently make up 13% of Cuba's workforce. Separately, privately run farming collectives in the agricultural sector employ hundreds of thousands of people. But with the current economic crisis and COVID-19 restrictions dampening demand for new businesses, Torres doesn't expect a boom this year. Is this the end of Cuba's communist economic system? No. Torres expects to see a shift in economic activity in the next few years, with the private sector growing and accounting for an increasing proportion of employment and GDP. But unlike what happened in Eastern European countries after the fall of the Soviet Union, because of conditions in Cuba, including political ones, the private sector won't become the majority of economic activity, at least in the medium term, he says. Though recent economic pressures have accelerated changes, Cuba's government has moved very slowly to enact reforms to its economy. Many of the changes rolled out this year were approved in 2016 or 2017, but have sat untouched since then. Other obstacles remain for would-be business owners in Cuba. Though entrepreneurs can hire others to join their business, a restaurant owner can employ waiters, for example, or a taxi owner can let others drive their car, they cannot get legal recognition for their business as a company. Crucially, that means businesses can't access bank loans, and individuals must take on all the financial risk of themselves, according to Diaz-Castellanos, the consultant. Economists and business leaders are holding out hope that after these reforms, the government will pass a long-promised law permitting the establishment of small and medium-sized companies regarded as essential for the growth of a more productive private sector. Pedro Monreal, a Cuban economist based in Paris, says that to fundamentally alter Cuba's economic model, the government would have to not only allow the private sector to grow more rapidly, but also shrink the state's economic presence. They'd need to reduce the weight of the state in GDP, and that's not happening on a significant scale. The state isn't abandoning any sector. Monreal says Cuba's reforms are a long way off from the kind of shift to a market-driven economy that took place in China in the late 20th century. That country abandoned the model of centralized planning. It allows the market to distribute resources with state levers imposed over the market, he says. China has also privatized state-owned businesses. That's not happening anywhere in Cuba. Could it happen? Maybe, but not right now. What will the reforms mean for relations with the U.S.? It should help. The new labor rules in Cuba can't be read as a gesture to the new U.S. administration, given the other pressures driving the change, but they are well-timed. On the campaign trail, Biden indicated that he intended to restart the thaw in relations that began in the latter years of the Obama administration and was dramatically reversed by President Trump. Bloomberg reports that Biden plans to cut restrictions on Americans traveling to Cuba and sending remittances, two of the most painful Trump-era policies for the island. But Biden has also criticized the Cuban government's silencing of recent protests over cultural freedoms and the issue of Venezuela, where Cuba is supporting authoritarian leader Nicolas Maduro, could be a sticking point in negotiations on a détente. Cuba's reforms should strengthen the case in Washington for a change in U.S. policy, Torres says. One of the things in Obama's plan was to help the private sector expand as a motor of change in Cuba, he says. This transformation shows circumstances in Cuba are changing, and the U.S. is going to want to participate.
If you'd like better sleep and mornings with the right mindset in 2021, the new Audible Sleep Collection is designed for you, featuring meditations, sound baths, bedtime stories, soundscapes, and ASMR.